Welcome to Richplanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Today I will be speaking to a familiar guest who is here to talk about a subject that we haven't yet covered in any great detail on Richplanet: NASA's alleged missions to the Moon. Welcome, Andrew Johnson.
Thanks for inviting me back, Richard. Good to be here.
All right then. Now, recently Channel 5 screened a documentary all about this subject entitled "Did We Land on the Moon?" And throughout the programme it presented some of the evidence that people put forward to make the argument that they didn't land on the moon, but at the very end, it left it right to the end, it said, oh well, we can ignore all that because there's some fairly recent photographs of craft which have overflown the moon, lunar orbiter type craft, which has taken photographs of all of the remnants of the Apollo landers and all the rest of it. Now we're going to go over some of that evidence and a whole lot of other evidence which may not have been in the Channel 5 documentary, because just to give my sort of angle on this, if you like, it's a bit of a diversionary argument in my opinion. Did we land on the moon? Because when you get involved in that argument, did we land, did we not, did they go or not, what it does is it diverts you from two very, very important questions or facts. Firstly, is there more advanced technology than rocket technology that can go way beyond that in a secret space program? It diverts your mind from that. And secondly, it kind of makes you accept that the moon is completely inert and nothing's been there before now, if you like, or before 1969. And I also question that. So to me it's what I would call a phony bone of contention. Contention is brought around something which diverts your mind from elsewhere, because I'm fairly convinced there is a secret space program with craft that make the Apollo and the Space Shuttle missions look frankly toy-like.
I would agree, yes, I would agree with that.
And I actually it annoys me because people often say to me, Richard, have you been to the Kennedy Space Center? That's what they'll say, and they'll eulogize about going there. Oh, it's absolutely phenomenal. The technology there is amazing. Richard, you must go to the Kennedy Space Center. And I laugh at them and I say, what? You mean a firework? Because
yes.
that's what allegedly got us to the moon.
I think that just to add on to that a little bit. I mean, here we are, two engineers, who looked at the Apollo program perhaps in their youth. And I've said this to people. I looked at the Apollo program in my youth, and I was inspired by it. I thought how fantastic this is, how wonderful this technology is, and what an achievement it is that we've sent these people to the moon. And here we are, so many years later, questioning all of that. And I think that's also one of the keys, that we must be willing to question these things, even though we may be convinced, like you say, of the chap that said go to the Kennedy Space Center. We've got to be able to question whether what we're being shown at the Kennedy Space Center is actually, the sort of real thing that it's meant to represent, or is it, as you say, part of this phony bone of contention or a diversionary thing to divert our attention away from something else, bizarre though that seems.
Now, what makes me suspect there are far more exotic types of propulsion are whistleblowers such as Stan Deyo, Edward Teller's alleged involvement in a secret group that were, it was disclosed in the 1950s that they were looking at anti-gravity technology, which went into the black in round about 56, 57.
That's right. I mean, again, read Nick Cook's book Hunt for Zero Point, where he talks about that, and he mentions Project Winterhaven, which is Thomas Townsend Brown's work, and it appears that was the Thomas Townsend Brown work, which I believe you may be covering more in a future programme, hopefully. That went into the black. That's what Nick Cook, who's a defence journalist, suggests. And so there does seem to be some tie-in with the timing. That all the major US airspace corporations were looking at anti-gravity as some type of workable technology, or developing that as a workable technology, up until about 1956, and then it was like, oh no, that's ridiculous, we can't do that. Almost an overnight change, as Nick Cook documents. So
now, in my upcoming series of lectures in May this year, I will be looking at one of the alleged forms of alternative propulsion, which in my opinion just completely transcend the rocket-based putting explosives in a tube and setting fire to it. That's the extent of our supposed technology which has gotten us into space and to the moon, and I contend there's a far more advanced form of propulsion available that they've kept secret. Now, I'm actually open-minded on whether the rocket-based technology landed on the moon or not, and Andrew's presented me with a lot of evidence, because he contends that at least the rocket-based Apollo program never landed on the moon. That's what you would contend.
I would conclude from what I've looked at, yes, that cannot have taken place that way.
Okay, and we're going to look now, now that we've sort of set the scene, that we're not saying that we've not been into space. Right. We think there could be something major which has been kept under wraps, but we're going to look at the rocket-based systems, let's say, and ask the questions whether they could have got to the moon's surface and back. Now, Andrew's looked at this subject in a lot of detail over the years, and you're going to put forward your argument. Now, where do you want to start, Andrew?
I usually start by discussing the pedigree, what I call the pedigree of the Apollo program, really. And it's fairly common knowledge that a lot of the NASA rocket scientists were drawn from Nazi Germany. And we had the so-called paperclips conspiracy, that's the name given to it, and that was actually revealed to me for the first time in the 1980s in a BBC Horizon documentary, where it actually explained that these scientists were brought over at the end of the Second World War, following things like the V2 program, which launched all those rockets to London and so on. And it was Wernher von Braun.
And these were supersonic, which meant that you couldn't actually hear them.
Well, yes, I suppose that's true. I wasn't really thinking of that, but yes, that was...
Apparently in London, in the Blitz, people feared them because a supersonic rocket, you can't hear it coming because it's travelling faster than sound, so it would just go off. Whereas your classic Second World War bombers are... and then you get a chance to run for cover. But that was why people feared them, apparently, in London. Although I don't think they were that accurate, and I don't think they killed a lot of people.
I mean, there were a lot of problems they had to solve, getting them up in the air, the guidance systems, and so on. So there was a lot of technology involved at that time. And it was Wernher von Braun who was apparently the chief rocket scientist.
But we didn't have technology where you could fire a rocket from London and hit Germany. That technology didn't exist. But they did. They could fire rockets from Germany that would land on London.
Right. That is apparently the case.
Or they were developing that in the latter stages of the war.
And the Doodlebug and the V2, as I say.
Right.
And then a lot of those scientists end up working in the States, and they obviously did a sort of brain drain from Nazi Germany, and they used it probably to build up their own military-industrial complex. But then that kind of, when the Soviets put up Sputnik in 1957, that seemed to be sort of the start of the space race, and the US then said, we've now got to get satellites because the Russians could bomb us from space. I guess that's the sort of psychology and mentality that they were using at that time. But then, so a lot of those scientists ended up as part of the NASA's rocketry development program. Chief among them, as I say, was Wernher von Braun, who worked for the Nazi regime. So we got this quote from Wernher von Braun. This is from his book, Conquest of the Moon. And he says, "It is commonly believed that man will fly directly from the Earth to the Moon, but to do this we would require a vehicle of such gigantic proportions that it would prove an economic impossibility. It would have to develop sufficient speed to penetrate the atmosphere and overcome the Earth's gravity, and having travelled all the way to the Moon, it must still have enough fuel to land safely and make the return trip to the Earth. Furthermore, in order to give the expedition a margin of safety, we would not use one ship alone, but a minimum of 3. Each rocket ship would be taller than New York's Empire State Building, almost a quarter of a mile high, and weigh about 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons. And you can see this clip in Apollo 0, which is a free online documentary where you'll see the cover of that book.
And that was 1953 made that statement.
I believe it was 53 that book came out.
This is a guy who can do all of the calculation with regards how much oxygen and hydrogen propulsion can produce, and he's worked out how much fuel is needed to get there and to get back using standard sort of calculations. And he's
Right. I mean, one of the key things I understand it from what I know about rocket science is delta V, the change in velocity, because at each manoeuvre you're going to change velocity in some way, either to speed up or to slow down or to turn a corner. And that's obviously when you use the fleet fuel, so you have to calculate all the changes in velocity that are going to occur, and then based on that you know how much fuel you're going to use based on the mass of the vehicle that you're going to use.
Right. All right. Well, what about the fact that once you've at a fixed velocity heading towards your target in the moon, in space, you don't really need any additional fuel. You're just sort of freewheeling, if you like.
That's right. But
even
then you need to slow down, don't you? When you come to the moon, you need to slow down.
Obviously,
in a controlled manner, and maybe in various stages. So each of those stages you use up fuel.
Yeah. Okay. So what have you got for us next?
Well, and then you look at, for example, the history of the Apollo program. That's peppered with some very strange events. For example, most people are aware that 3 of the early astronauts were killed in a fire in the capsule, and one of these astronauts was Gus Grissom, and he was signed up early onto the Apollo program, and they started the training and so on, and they were working with sort of developmental rockets and capsules, and there's this clip of him talking, saying, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't even communicate between 3 buildings, when they weren't even able to talk from the capsule to one building to another. They couldn't do it because they messed up the wiring or the radio signals or whatever. And he, after a few weeks or months, he became a critic and said that this program was in such a shambles that they were never going to make it to the moon. And he thought, because Kennedy had done this with such fanfare, people needed to know about this. So he organised a press conference. And there's this story which is in this Apollo 0 movie, and it's also documented, that Gus Grissom went as far as taking a lemon from his lemon tree and put it on a coat hanger, and then hanging it on the Apollo capsule when he was going in for his latest sort of set of training, because this thing was a lemon. It was never going to work. It was never going to do its job. It was never going to fly.
Right.
And then, following that press conference by Gus Grissom, an inquiry was launched into the state of the Apollo program, and that was written up and it was presented to the appropriate part of the government as a review of the state of the Apollo program. And he was also very critical. He said they would never be able to do it by 1969.
Right.
And both of those people, the person who wrote the report and Gus Grissom, ended up dead. Gus Grissom in the fire, which his son Scott Grissom later asked for an inquiry into that event, and what Scott Grissom uncovered was that it did seem that the capsule had been rigged for the fire to start.
Right.
He thinks the fire was started deliberately so that Gus Grissom. It does appear to me, and I would tend to agree, that Gus Grissom, because he was speaking out, they knew they wouldn't be able to help. They wouldn't be able to keep a lid on the Apollo program because he was an honest guy. He was going to speak out. So they killed him.
So you think he could have been murdered by NASA?
I think he was murdered in the Apollo 1 fire, along with I think Ed White, and I can't remember unfortunately the name of the third astronaut that died in that event.
All right. Now, what about a lot of evidence has been put forward, photographic and video evidence, because there's a lot of images allegedly taken on the moon, which I know a lot of people will pick fault with. Where do you stand on all of that evidence, Andrew?
Well, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I know Marcus Allen, for example, talks a lot about these images, and I've seen a couple of his presentations. They're very good.
Some notable ones, just off the top of my head. There's one where there's a rock on the surface of the moon, and it's got the number C written on it. So it looks like a prop. And other ones, such as one astronaut's shadow is twice the length of another astronaut's shadow, which suggests the light source is close to the astronauts, within so many feet. The sun couldn't possibly produce shadows of that length. Therefore, it's It's a floodlight, which wasn't available to
There are
them.
arguments about the angle, the length and direction of the shadows, but
that's not the evidence you
I don't
use.
focus on that
right.
because you can contest it. I mean, we've got this example. So one of the ones that comes up quite often with the shadow argument is the clip of Aldrin coming out of the lunar module, and it is claimed by the people who think the photographs are fake that the illumination of Aldrin cannot be real because the sun is behind the lunar module, and therefore Aldrin should be completely in shadow, and you would not be able to see him, but yet he's fairly well lit. But I saw quite an interesting simulation on a web page which I looked up, and basically what this chap did is to test this idea that Aldrin should have been in shadow. He set up a spotlight and shone it onto a tennis court, which is quite close, an asphalt tennis court, not a grass one, quite close in colour to the lunar surface, very dark, and he set up some tin cans on the ground, and you can see here, which will show this slide, you can see that he was able to see the dark side away from the light source quite well in shadow. So to me, although that photograph still could be fake, I don't think it's conclusive. You can contest this idea that shadows would have completely obscured Aldrin, because in this simulation of that same situation you can see the dark side of the object, what would be in the shadow. So I don't think those arguments are conclusive. I think they're testable.
Right. Now there's people also suggest, and I think you've got another slide that might back this up, that Stanley Kubrick, who had been making the film, was it 2001 A Space Odyssey, around that time, that NASA used some of his sets, and in particular a technique that he used which was ahead of its time then, it was a front projection screen system.
Right.
What that did, it would allow you to use a screen to put a background on a foreground sort of thing.
If we take it that the photographs were faked, well, who faked them? Did they have some specialist unit to do it, or did they invite or otherwise get somebody like Stanley Kubrick to do it? And when we discussed this and people said this to me a few years ago, I thought, that's just nonsense, that's just ridiculous. There's how are you ever going to prove that? It's just ridiculous. But there is a very interesting documentary made by Jay Weidner called Kubrick's Odyssey, which, as you just mentioned there, looks at the front projection system, and then looks at some of the shots from the film 2001, Kubrick's space film, which coincidentally came out in 1968, which was the year before the moon landing, or the alleged moon landing. And it appears that if you look at the history of 2001, the development of that film paralleled the development of the Apollo program, and even Jay Weidner points out that one of the scientists who was consulting with NASA on the Apollo program also works as a consultant on 2001. I mean, that doesn't really, that's he was probably just a good space scientist. It doesn't really prove anything. Right. But we have a couple of images of interest, in particular, which I think do possibly illustrate this front projection technique where it's been used. And this is one that's been put together by David Percy, and I've just made an animated version of it.
This is a NASA photograph. Yeah.
This is the Apollo 17 mission. So what we've got here is we have two pictures taken supposedly at different times on the same mission, both Apollo 17, and we see that in one shot we see a large lunar module quite close to it, maybe, 20 feet away or something, and then in another shot we see an astronaut in the foreground, and we see the lunar module over to the right in the distance, maybe 300-400 yards away, something like that. But when you overlay these two sets of images, you can see that the backdrop is identical. The field within the backdrop is absolutely identical.
So there's no way the lunar module would move from there over to there, where it is.
How would it? It would have to take off and land again if that's indeed what happened, which is clearly ridiculous.
So that's a fake background.
I think that this indicates that Jay Weidner is right, and what we're seeing, this line here, is the edge of the stage, and we've got the front projection in the backdrop.
Right. And Weidner does demonstrate he draws a line on a lot of the NASA images saying, right, that's the end of the set, and that's where the
screen is.
That's where the screen starts.
Yeah. So I mean, I think
that's the giveaway in this front projection screen system.
Right.
You always have a border or a line where the set ends and the screen starts, and it's that line that you can sometimes identify, because the texture of the set will be slightly different to the texture of the artificial background.
Correct. They can't quite match up the the details of it, and I think that is, I would get, to me, that I think that is what we're seeing in this picture. You can see just below the hill there, we've got that front projection line going right across from right to left.
And of course, this is quite a late mission. Apollo 17. So what year we're talking? Early 70s?
That would have been early 70s, I think. Yeah, again, I don't know all the dates of all the missions, and people have criticised me because I don't know all the Apollo statistics, and so on. But
all right, Andrew. Well, we'll talk more after this break. Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about the Apollo missions. Now then, we were just looking at this image of an Apollo 17 mission, which to me, assuming that's correct, that they're both NASA images, that's a smoking gun really for me. What do you want to talk about next, Andrew?
Well, again, there's probably one of the other things which isn't discussed that much on the web is the pictures of the lunar rover. There's some interesting things about the lunar rover. As you may be aware, the lunar rover was only taken up to the moon, according to the official story, on the later missions. It wasn't, I don't think, until Apollo 16, I think, was the first mission where they used a rover. Other people have measured, for example, the size of the rover and found that even if the wheels were folded up, as is claimed, there wasn't enough space to it to fit. Wasn't enough space for it to fit in the command module. Right. Other people have, I haven't done that measurement, but apparently people like Jim Collier did that, and say that they didn't have enough space for it in the first place. These pictures that I've got on the screen here, which we can show, are very unusual. They look fine, again, when you look at them initially, but if you study them carefully, there are no tracks around the wheels. It's like this rover has been picked up with a crane and dumped on the set, or the tracks go in the wrong direction. What image over on the right, which is AS17 135 20544, you can see there aren't any tracks, in the front or back of the rover. It looks like it's just been dumped on the set. So I have those problems. Whilst we're on the subject of the lunar rover, I can also go to some other data which somebody sent me a few years ago, and it's to do with the battery system on the rover. Before you go to that, Andrew, we need to just explain what the surface temperature of the moon is when it's lit by the sun. Just explain. Yes, well, I mean, again, if you go and look at the official data for the surface of the moon, I wouldn't use Wikipedia. I avoided that source, but the actual surface temperature on the moon averages 107 degrees centigrade. So that's the average temperature on the surface of the moon. So that's higher than boiling water. Right, so 107 degrees centigrade. That's the average, not the maximum, that's the average temperature. So that's 224 Fahrenheit to do the conversion. And somebody sent me a few years ago an interesting link. A chap in Germany actually sent me this link. So go and look at the Lunar Rover Vehicle Operations Manual. And this is a public document. It's on the NASA, one of the NASA archives, and you can go and download this document yourself. And it actually gives the specification and the tolerances for parts of the lunar rover system, one of which is the battery. And if you look at this column of data, these columns of data on their own data, maximum operating temperature limit for the lunar rover battery is 125 Fahrenheit. 125 Fahrenheit. Which is in centigrade? It's going to be about sort of times by 5, divide by 9, and add 32 or something like that. Yeah, that's right. It's going to be about 80 or 90 80 centigrade, something like that. Just to make a comment from an engineer, right? Our
worked for years and years with hardware engineers designing all kinds of different things that would work outside on motorway systems, things in power stations, on railway lines. And when you're designing something, especially if it's going to work outside, whoever's manufacturing the subcomponents, there will be a temperature range that it will operate in, and you would not select that component, and if its operating range was outside of where it's going to be used, and that would be the most standard engineering practice to do that. So for me, that is another smoking gun, Andrew, that would fit a component, especially at NASA, into a device that specification was way outside its operating range. It's just the most basic of engineering errors.
Right, absolutely. So we have, you can see that right there from their own information, is the hardware would not have worked. So yeah, if the rover could not have worked, then why are they putting out this story that they took up a rover, took the rover to the surface of the moon? And also other people have pointed out, I haven't put it in my presentation, but you can speed up the film of the rover by about a factor of 1.5 times or 2 times, and it just looks like a car driving on a set, with the dust flying up and so on.
And there's another, you mentioned earlier that there's no cooling system on those rovers, which would mean they would be ridiculously hot.
Right.
Okay.
The components would all get very, very hot, and the tyres would get very hot as well. Obviously, the rover can withstand heat and so on, but all kinds of problems like that.
And the same applies to the module that they used to get off the moon as well. That would have it was on the surface for hours.
Right. I mean, I think they were landed for 7-8 hours or something on the first mission. I don't think they were there very long. But I've pointed out to people, I think in this presentation I also make a point of it. If you drive to the supermarket and you're on an asphalt surface, you go in and get some stuff, and it's a hot sunny day in the middle of the summer, and it's 25-30 degrees. You put the windows up so that nobody nicks anything from your car. You come back to your car after maybe half an hour, an hour, and you put your hands on the wheel, and you're going to hurt your hands. It's going to be.
And if it was 107 degrees,
how did they maintain the internal temperature to something that the astronauts could stand? They claim that they had battery power for the air conditioning. That's the official claim, as I understand it, that the air conditioning within the module was battery powered. But you can compare it to a car, because you've got 3 guys in there, so you're going to have a similar sort of volume of air within the module to a car. You don't have any convection on the moon because there's no atmosphere, so a car can be cooled by convection. In other words, when you start driving the car, the air coming past the car will cool it down. You can't do that on the moon because there's no gas to give that sort of cooling. So you can only cool it by radiation. So how did they do it? How did they keep the lunar module cool? I mean, to me, when I thought about it, I never thought about this years ago. When I believed the Apollo story. How did they keep it cool?
Now, also related to temperature on the surface of the moon, one of the astronauts on the later missions actually placed an object on the moon is for sort of sentimental reasons. Just tell us about that. And you've done a little experiment to try and replicate this.
That's right. Charlie Duke, what he decided to do is because of Mama's apple pie and those sorts of American, cultural ideals. Looking at the Charlie Duke photograph, Charlie Duke was one of the astronauts on Apollo 17, I think, or Apollo 16. And he took this photograph of his family with him, and he put it in a clear plastic bag, and he put it on the surface of the moon. And we have a NASA image of that family photograph. In other words, a photograph of a photograph allegedly on the surface of the moon. And I saw this web page 2, 3, 4 years ago, and it said, well, this is impossible because the average temperature of the moon, the average temperature is over 100 degrees, 107 Fahrenheit. And if you have
centigrade.
Centigrade, correct. 225 Fahrenheit, so above the boiling point of water. And if you have a photograph, now remember, photographic paper is made of a number of layers. It's got a layer that actually takes the image and makes the image with whatever chemicals they put on there, that have like a card layer behind it to give it some rigidity. And those layers, when heated up, expand at different rates. Just like a bimetallic strip in a thermostat would. So this photograph will curl up, and you can show this. All you need to do is get a photograph, put it into an oven, and it will curl up.
And you did that. So let's just take a look at it.
So here we have a family photograph, and over here we have an oven, and this oven is set to 100 degrees centigrade, and I'm now going to put this photograph in the oven. She's cooking some of my dinner, and then I'm going to watch it through the glass. And that you can see that in very short order trying to get better light, but you'll see it when I open it. This is curling up within seconds. So I think that's a pretty convincing demonstration. And here it is. You can see it there curled up, and that's only at 100 degrees centigrade.
Would it behave the same with air around it, do you think, Andrew? Do you think that
right,
makes
well, I mean,
a
that's the
difference?
question. I haven't done this in a vacuum, so it's not a 100% accurate simulation, but I don't know of any reason why having air around it would
stop it from curling.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. I mean, obviously in this example the air is transferring the heat to the photograph, but in the example of the surface of the moon, the bag was in contact with the surface of the moon, yet it didn't. There appears to be no significant effects on the heat. So that right there, to me, proves that that photograph cannot be taken on the surface of the moon.
Right. And you showed an image of a footprint, which is a very famous image,
right,
from an astronaut's boot, which shows very clear, very well defined lines of the sole of this boot, and you would contend that that looks like it's got moisture in it.
Well, this is, again, if you look at that image, it's the iconic image of the first footprint on the moon. I made a couple of observations about this photograph. Remember, these were cameras were mounted on the chests of the astronaut, so he's going to have to bend right over to take a good clear picture of this. They had no viewfinders, but the shot is well framed. So that's one comment about that particular photograph. But the other comment, as you said, is about the impression. If you look at the way that those grooves of the boot are pressed into the surface of the moon, to me, maybe some expert in materials who can correct me on this if I'm wrong, because I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this, but to me, to get that sort of impression, you need moisture to bind those particles of together.
So if you were on just a sandy beach with no moisture, it wouldn't leave a print like that.
No. If you've got Wellington boots on and you're on the top part of a beach away from the sea, where the sand is all dried out completely and it's just grains, you don't get footprints like that.
But you would nearer the sea where it's still damp.
Correct. And that looks like that footprint has been made in some type of sand with moisture in it.
Right. All right.
So
and the surface of the moon won't have moisture in it?
Apparently not, because again it's 100 degrees centigrade, so any moisture would have boiled off.
Now, I mentioned in the Channel 5 documentary, probably the main argument they used to debunk the people who don't think we landed on the moon was the photo. They said recent photographs have been taken by lunar orbiter that's overflown most of the Apollo landing sites and filmed all of the junk that was left behind, the rovers, the flags, and the actual craft. So is that not incontrovertible evidence, Andrew?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you? And people have made various claims about these images, and we talked about these Chinese images, which have supposed I've not seen those. I've not.
We'll come on to that.
Right. Okay. But this story for me starts probably 4 or 5 years ago when somebody sent me an email and saying, well, Andrew, can the Hubble telescope see the images on the moon? Because everyone's heard of the Hubble telescope. It's a big, space telescope, very powerful and so on. Takes all these wonderful images of the various galaxies and so forth.
So the argument is, all they have to do is point the Hubble telescope at the moon and they'll see everything that's on there.
End of story. Sorted out, Okay. But again, it's not as simple as that, because if you look at the figures, and it's easier than you think to work this out, and we can explain this very easily with a bit of sort of GCSE level trigonometry, basically. And we can say, well, we know the size of the lunar module approximately. It's 4.2 meters across, so we've got an object sitting on the moon. If you're looking at it in plan view, it's 4.2 meters across, basically. You can then look at what the distance from the Earth to the Moon is, which is 385,000 kilometres. That's sort of an average figure. Obviously it goes up and down from that because of apogee and perigee and so on. But if we take those as a basic set of figures, you can add a factor of 10 either side of that if you really need to, and this will still show the answer. And then you end up with what's called an isosceles triangle, and you can work out the angle, because why we want to work out that angle that I've labelled on the diagram is that equates to what's called the resolving power of a telescope. Any telescope that's built, it can resolve individual objects of a certain size, and that size is measured as an angular separation, not a physical size, because the angular size is what you actually see, and the physical size varies.
Just to explain that, Andrew. Okay, so if you look at the Moon and draw a line from your eye to the top of the Moon, and draw another line from your eye to the bottom of the Moon, they make an angle. That is the angle subtended to your eye, and each telescope will have that. It's a very, very small angle that telescopes can normally resolve.
Correct.
Can see objects at an angle that small. So the Hubble telescope has a resolving angle. Yeah.
That's right, and you can check out what that is. You can find that information. It's measured in seconds of arc, because as people probably know, a circle is divided into 360 degrees, and then each degree is divided into 60 minutes, and then each minute is divided into 60 seconds.
Right.
So in each degree you've got 3,600 seconds of arc, and you can look up the Hubble's resolving power, and it comes out at 0.05 seconds of arc. So that's, as a fraction of a degree, that's 0.05 over 3,600. So it's 1.389 times 10 to the minus 5 degrees is the resolving power, if you will, of the Hubble Space Telescope. Or depending, we have another figure which I found, and that came out as 3.89 times 10 to the minus 6 degrees. So that makes it even more sensitive. It can resolve even smaller objects. Right. But if you do the calculation for the lunar module, you come out with a figure of 3.3, or rather 6.26 times 10 to the minus 7 degrees. So the angular size of the lunar module on the surface of the Moon is 6.26 times 10 to the minus 7 degrees.
And that's a factor of 10 times too small.
Correct.
For the Hubble to be able to see.
Yeah, correct. Right. So it's 10. Essentially, it's actually about 20 times. Right. Yeah.
So if the lunar module was, say, 30 times bigger, then it would be able to see it.
Right.
But it can't because it's too small.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. According to the figures that I've been able to work out, and obviously, if there's any viewer that finds an error in these calculations, they've been up on my website for several years, and I had one small correction, but it was only by a factor of 2, which didn't affect the factor of 10. So if anybody finds an error, that I'd welcome any criticism of that, of any part of the argument. So in other words, all we can say is that Hubble's no good, can't do it with Hubble, and so we have to look at something else. Right.
So NASA brought out these images of all of the remnants of the Apollo missions.
Correct.
All right. So case solved.
That's right. Of course, NASA had what's called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. I talk about this in this presentation that I put together, and that was launched June the 18th, 2009.
Well, just hold it there, Andrew. We're going to go for another break, and we'll be looking at NASA's alleged images of the Apollo relics after this break. Welcome back. I'm with Andrew Johnson, and we're going to look at some images put out by NASA which allegedly show the remnants of the Apollo programs taken by lunar orbiter craft. In what year did he say, Andrew?
Well, what happened was in 2009 the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter was launched. It had a high resolution camera, sort of better than the previous one, and I think the original mission for this was to look for new landing sites for the new moon mission program, which was announced some years earlier. Now it's all been scrapped, and we'll mention that again later. But so Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, everyone said, oh, we're going to get these new high resolution pictures of the Moon. we're going to fly over the old landing sites, we'll be able to see the craft, and that'll, you know, prove all these crazy conspiracy theorists, you know, wrong. So these were images awaited with great fanfare, and finally, I think it was the 11th of August 2009, sorry, 11th of September I think it was actually, when these came out, 2009. Yeah, it was an interesting date. Was it the 11th of November, or it's 9/11? It was 9/11 date anyway.
Yeah.
And what we see on NASA's website is the supposed picture of the Apollo 11 site, and the Apollo 11 lunar excursion module, the LEM, is shown as basically a sort of reasonable sized white blob with 3 and a bit white blobs around it. And you can see this
sort of the feet.
The feet, exactly.
Right.
Feet of the actual you know, the landing part that they left on the moon. So basically with this,
and there's a scale on there.
There's a scale on
their image.
Correct, and they give you this figure of 200 meters. So when you look at the space between these dots, which is meant to be the feet, you know, of the lunar excursion module's landing section, you can then work out how big this distance is, because they give you a scale. So this is what I did. I worked this out. So I found out the size of the distance between the feet, which is of the lunar module excursion, lunar excursion module, and it's 31 feet diagonally across.
Along the longer length, yeah. Okay.
Right. So if you plug that into the figures that NASA gives you for the size of this image, that lunar excursion module landing section should fit into a space at 7 by 7 pixels on that image. 7 by 7 pixels. That's the figure you come out with. Or maybe it'd be 8 by 8,
okay,
possibly 9 by 9 or something. You know, you could maybe slight margin of error, something around that figure. So when I actually measured what this alleged photograph shows, and I measured the distance across, it's basically a distance of about 28 pixels.
Right.
Which means
so it's a factor of 4 too big.
Roughly between 3 and 4, depending on how you sort of turn the image and so forth.
Right.
But
so it's completely the wrong size.
Yeah.
The image
So it's the wrong size. It's the wrong size.
And we were talking about UFOs.
We were.
And
funnily enough,
let's say I brought out an image. I had someone on the show who was eulogizing about an image. Hey,
let's say it was taken from a helicopter.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey Richard, I was in my helicopter the other day and I filmed this UFO. It's phenomenal. Look at it. Look at the picture. And if they showed that, what would people say? Exactly.
If you showed that as an image of an alleged UFO that you took, and you didn't have anybody else's photograph of it to back you up, would you believe that that was a metal object resting on the ground below you? Would you believe that that was a real photograph? Yeah. People will believe this because it's on NASA's website.
Yeah. Because NASA say that is the Apollo 11 craft, then people believe it is. Yeah,
exactly. But if you look at the quality of that image and you study this, I don't know whether this will come out on the video.
As you say, it's a white blob, Andrew. Could be anything.
Right. You know, and then you look at these other, and then what I tried to do is I tried to get an impression of what it should look like, and I managed to find, this isn't again a totally realistic image, because we see the lunar module in orbit rather than landed, but I tried to get an impression of what we should see on that LRO image. And
by resizing it,
to a 7 by 7 pixel image, or a 25 by 25 pixel image, which is the size I calculated it to be, and then I compared that with the NASA image, and there is, you know, it just doesn't add up.
If you compare it to Google Maps or Google Earth, which a lot of people are familiar with now, it's pathetic.
It is. Now we've got to be careful here, because I actually made a mistake with this part of the analysis originally, in that we look at the Google Earth images, and but some of those are not from a satellite. Some of them are aerial photographs.
Right.
The ones that are lower down, the Google Earth ones. Some of them from aerial. Some of them above a certain height are from a satellite, and some are from a plane. But we do have a comparison with GeoEye, and this is something that J.R. White has done. He's another researcher that's posted quite a few videos about this, and we have a GeoEye image which is essentially the same resolution as the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter.
Just to stop you there, Andrew, GeoEye is a satellite which goes around the Earth and takes photographs.
Correct.
At a particular height or distance.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I think they've got their own website and stuff. I think they sell these images I don't think this satellite is owned by NASA. I think it's privately owned by a consortium or something.
So he's compared images of Earth taken by that satellite with images taken by lunar orbiters.
Right, and I think that because the image resolution is comparable according to the the information given by NASA.
You should get the same level of detail.
Same level of detail. So in this particular example, we see a GeoEye image, and you can actually see a car on the road, and you can see with some, you can see it's in colour. You can see the colour of the car.
Yeah.
You can see that it's maybe got a white bonnet or a cream bonnet or something. But you can see that it's, you can see that it's an oblong shape. There's right shape for a car and everything, and you can measure it and work out the size. So why haven't we got? And there's none of these vertical grainy lines either. If you look at those LRO images, they've got these vertical lines in them for some reason, which I don't really understand what those are. So if you compare these two images,
why isn't it in colour for one?
Why isn't it in colour? Why? And the same goes with the images from Mars. Why are we still predominantly getting black and white images?
Well, we'll come on to Mars.
Come on to that. so, but that going back to that. So why have we got such rubbish images from LRO?
Yeah.
The ones from GeoEye are pretty good.
Yeah. So the first one that they put out, allegedly of Apollo 11, it's just a white blob, and it's completely the wrong size. It's 4 times too big.
Right.
Now, what about the other images? Because they brought out other images of the other Apollo landing sites.
Right. And in fact, on this particular slide, we've also got a couple of things. We've got, I think this is on the bottom right here. We've got the Apollo 16 lunar module, which you'll see looks different again. We've got this sort of, it looks like it's exploded. We've got this black smearing around it. And on one of the other ones, we could dig this up as we go through it. But if you look, I think the latest images, it does look a lot better. They've actually made it look like a lunar module now. I didn't check the size of it because that came out after I put the original presentation together. I think they did another image in 2011, around about that sort of time, possibly early 2012. And they've improved the look. It looks more like a real lunar module now.
Right.
But here we see the lunar rover parking spot on the right here. This is their label. This is what they say. We've just got this black smudge with a few white dots next to it. That according to NASA, is the lunar rover vehicle. Which, if if we remind ourselves what it looked like, going back to this slide, we've got the lunar rover parking spot. And it's a black smudge.
Right.
What's that about?
Right.
Is that really become that? I mean, does this make any sense? It certainly doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Why is there a black zone around what looks like this solid area in the middle? What's the black zone? Presumably it's shadow, but shadow wouldn't be cast like that. You wouldn't have thought all around it.
No.
Looks a bit strange.
It does.
So you would contend that all of those images are bogus then?
I would contend that they must be bogus, yes.
Right. I've heard 2 different stories about the Chinese images, because they are alleged to have had lunar orbiter, is that?
I believe so, yeah.
Right, so I heard initially that they'd brought out images in, I think, February 2012, but I had an email from somebody saying, well, actually, why haven't they released them for public viewing? So I'm not sure whether the Chinese images are available, but they're alleged to be extremely high definition. So maybe we can check that after the show and just put a caption on as to the status of this.
Right.
People would say, well, if China have seen them, then they're obviously there, because China represent an independent adjudicator, if you like. This is one argument that I always use as to why I'm ambivalent about it. I don't get caught up in the argument of whether we landed or not, because there was no guy with his clipboard stood there on the surface of the moon watching the thing come down, going, yep, tick, landed, tick, like they do in the national lottery. They have a guy there with his white gloves on, an independent adjudicator. Where is the independent adjudicator in the Apollo landings? We've got NASA and NASA's word. Hey, China is the independent adjudicator. But hang on, is China independent? Which was a comment that Judy Wood made in the previous show.
Right.
Do we believe that at some level countries are actually acting independently, especially with pertaining to space? Or is there some overarching agenda? there's a lot of information that Andrew has on the moon landing, so we're actually going to film a second show. I think that, that there are other things that they're possibly hiding as well, concerning what is on the moon and the UFO phenomenon as well, which we'll probably talk about that next week.
All right, secret space program on the second week.
Right. Let's just address some of the arguments which people claim prove that they did land on the moon with the rocket-based Apollo missions. Now, there's a radio dish was placed in Australia because the Apollo, the position of the Apollo craft wasn't always in radio contact with NASA, so they had to use a radio station on the southern hemisphere, which relayed messages. So how could they fabricate that?
Right, yeah, I mean, there's this story is told in the film The Dish, which has got Sam Neill in it, and these two guys in the outback working this dish, which made sure they had to make sure it worked to pick up the signal from the landing. And but that doesn't prove they landed, because it's very easy to put a transmitter in a space capsule and send it to the moon. I mean, if unmanned probes had landed on the moon already, such as Lunar Cod 1, the Soviet rover,
and you would agree that they landed on the moon?
I think they must have landed, unmanned probes on the moon. Right. I'm pretty sure that they went. But the manned missions, that would be a completely different kettle of fish.
And that's the other question you're talking about, communication with NASA. You've got this room full of operators looking at screens who are all monitoring different elements of the mission. They might be monitoring the astronaut's heart rate or the voltages within the cabin, and then you see them all get up and cheer and hug each other when they've allegedly landed. So what, are they all part of the conspiracy, Andrew?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Another good question. Are all these people looking at all these screens part of it? Were they all told not to talk? To me, the most obvious thing seems to be that they they did have to set up simulations for the equipment to run through all the procedures. For most of them, for the majority of them, they may be watching one or two systems, looking at the measurements coming back, the telemetry. Are they going to know whether they're watching a simulation or the real thing?
Okay, so you think the majority of them would have been duped as well, so they keep as few people into the...
Right, I think so.
Now, what about Apollo 13, I think it was, where they had a problem and they started losing oxygen in the cabin as they were coming back? Is that right? Was it Apollo 13?
No, they never got there. They had to
turn back, and they had to manufacture something which would get rid of the carbon dioxide to keep them alive, basically. And all of these scientists at NASA started scratching their heads saying, well, what's in the cabin? What can we give them to make? And they made a device which would get rid of the carbon dioxide. So do you think that's all true?
Well, I don't think Apollo 13 landed on the moon. I don't even think it went round the moon. So that again was a whole thing was stage managed. I think partly because people were losing interest in the Apollo mission, and they needed to keep its profile high enough for long enough to do what they wanted to do, which we'll perhaps talk about in the next program. But one of the things that John Lear pointed out about the Apollo 13, which I believe is correct, and again, if any of you wants to verify this and find different, then great, if we can be corrected on anything that's wrong, or I can be corrected on anything wrong. But John Lear said that if you look at the proposed time for the landing of Apollo 13 on the moon, which it never actually landed, according to the official story, it would have landed in darkness. And I've simulated this in a solar system simulator called Redshift.
Yeah.
You can look at the timing of the landing, and indeed it appears that it would have landed on the dark limb or very close to being in the dark. And you would not land.
They would never do that.
No, they would never be land in the dark.
It would create immense problems for them to land in complete pitch black.
Right.
All right. Now you mentioned John Lear, and he has analysed a lot of the early images put out of the moon, as has Bill Cooper. And they actually claim there are structures on the moon, which we'll look at next week into those claims. And also, just to touch on the astronauts, because we're going to take a closer look at what some of the astronauts have said in next week's show. You contend that that they are all either persuaded or mind controlled in some way to perhaps either believe that they did walk on the moon when actually they didn't.
Well, I mean, again, if you look at their behaviour, or those that have been, interviewed about this, I mean, like, a couple of them are dead and so on. And Neil Armstrong died recently, obviously. But if you look at their behaviour, it indicates that they do believe their story. But the stories are not consistent. The stories don't add up.
Right.
That's the problem.
Okay, Andrew. Well, we're going to look more into the astronauts next week, but that's all for this week. And remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night. Welcome to Richplanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. I'd like to welcome back Andrew Johnson onto the show. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much for inviting me back.
Now then, last week we spoke about the moon and your contention that the Apollo missions did not land, and I made it clear that to me that's not the issue. The issue is that there is a secret space program which is way beyond rocket technology. So I think we've probably been there, but not necessarily with rockets. And I think that the argument over whether we landed with Apollo is a diversion, and it's a diversion from more than one thing.
Right.
I think it's a diversion from a secret space program, and possibly that there is stuff on the moon, and possibly has been there for a long time. Now, you presented a lot of your evidence as to why the Apollo missions, the evidence that couldn't really have got there using the technology that they allegedly used in those missions, and that we covered all of that last week. Now this week we're going to focus more on the astronauts, in particular the three astronauts who allegedly first went to the moon, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and of course Neil Armstrong, who died very recently. Can you just give us a bit of background to the astronauts and what they've said?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, isn't it? If you actually start to listen to what the astronauts have actually said, some very strange things start to come into view. Mm-hmm. And what Neil Armstrong has said, for example, I actually entitled my presentation after what Neil Armstrong said, mm-hmm. because he talks about there being great ideas, to be discovered if you can remove one of the truth's protective layers. Mm-hmm. And he said that in 1994 during the 25th anniversary for the moon landing, in the presence of Bill Clinton and Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin, and I think hopefully we're going to play that short clip. Yeah. And he starts off this speech as well with some remarks about a parrot. And I think it's worth people listening to those, mm-hmm. because my I'll say it plainly, my contention is that Neil Armstrong was, when he was talking about the parrot, was referring to Gus Grissom, because he talks about the parrot, can talk but it doesn't fly very well, which is exactly what happened to Gus Grissom. He talked but he didn't fly very well at all. In other words, they killed him. And also Neil Armstrong has been very guarded about certain things. And these, we've got this clip. I think we're going to show this other clip where Bart Sibrel confronts him with the Bible.
We'll come on to that later, but first we'll look at this clip. This was at the White House, and I think you said to me before that Armstrong had just got divorced around about this time.
Around about that time, yeah. I learned, and later he did an interview in 2005 with Ed Bradley. I think it was Ed Bradley, said in the sort of background information that Armstrong had, his marriage of 38 years had broken up in 1994, which was the very year he made this speech at the anniversary. And looking at his body language, which is one thing I know you talk a lot about, Richard. You're much better at that than I am in reading it. I mean. You look at his body language, and it looks like he's saying, "Look, I'm going to tell now. I'm fed up of keeping this secret. I'm going to tell as much as I can," and that's what Neil Armstrong said to me in that speech.
Right. Okay. Now let's just take a look at that then. I'll call that one up.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, Mr. President, members of Congress, fellow astronauts. Ladies and gentlemen, Wilbur Wright once noted that the only bird that could talk was the parrot, and he didn't fly very well.
So it didn't fly very well. Everyone's laughing there, Andrew. But you think Armstrong's referring to someone who was murdered, one of his colleagues?
I think he's referring to Grissom, yeah.
All right.
So I'll be brief. This week, America has been recalling the Apollo program and reliving the memories of those times in which so many of us here, colleagues here in the first rows, were immersed. Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers. There are places to go beyond belief. Those challenges are yours. In many fields, not the least of which is space, because there lies human destiny.
Remove one of truth's protective layers. He's not talking about scientific discovery with that statement, is he?
I was surprised by that speech, because if he was talking about discoveries, he would say, we've had recent advances in computer technology, we're now getting the internet developing. He would have known about the early development of the internet, I'm sure, in the early 1990s when the internet started to get going, and the World Wide Web was started and so on. You would have thought he would have spoken more in that sort of language rather than truth's protective layers. I mean, protecting what exactly? And
let's just play the clip of the astronauts at the Apollo 11 press conference, where it clearly looks like they're uncomfortable with what they're being asked to do at the conference. They just returned from the moon a few weeks earlier, and it's their first sort of public airing. Just watch the body language in this clip.
It was our pleasure to have participated in one great adventure. It's an adventure that took place not just in the month of July, but rather one that took place in the last decade. We all here and the people listening in today had the opportunity to share that adventure over its developing and unfolding in the past months and years. It's our privilege today to share with you some of the details of that final month of July that was certainly the highlight for the three of us of that decade. We're going to divert a little bit from the format of past press conferences and talk about the things that interested us most, in particular the things that occurred on and about the moon. We will use a number of films and slides which most of you have already seen, and with the intent of pointing out some of the things that we observed on the spot which may not be obvious to those of you who are looking at them here from the surface of Earth. Our memory of that actually differs little from the reports that you have all heard from those previous Saturn V flights. And
when you first stepped on the moon, did it strike you as you were stepping on a piece of the Earth, or sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert, or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point?
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We'd been orbiting around the moon for quite a while. At the same time, we have experience.
What do you consider the most important piece of advice and recommendation that you will give the Apollo 12 crew before they take off for the moon in November, gentlemen?
I didn't hear the first part. The recommendations for 12 on which phase?
Will be the most important piece of advice or recommendation for the Apollo 12 crew.
I think we can say that overall we wouldn't change the plan that we used or the plan that they intended.
Will you recommend any changes in procedures for the moonwalking and exploration procedure? And did you find that your suits were mobile enough in view of the changes, or would you recommend further mobility features for them for operation on the moon?
Well, one gets used to the type mobility that your suit affords you.
Secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
Many of us and many other people in many places have speculated on the meaning of this first landing on another body in space. Would each of you give us your estimate of what is the meaning of this to all of us?
You want to try that? Yeah, from you.
And of course, Andrew, these three guys all resigned shortly after they came back, which Neil Armstrong, I think, was going to be set up as NASA's spokesperson, this kind of thing, but quite a religious man, or very religious man, and the sort of man who I think Armstrong has strong principles. I think he's a highly reliable person, and I just think that he left because he was being asked to tell lies, possibly. What are your views on that?
Well, I mean, we could, again, we're speculating with the reason. We don't really know why he resigned. One could, one of the arguments that's just come into my mind, for example, is that they knew he was going to need to go on to do lots of interviews and lots of public appearances, which actually he didn't do that many of, but nevertheless, you could argue that that was going to take up so much of his life that he wouldn't be able to continue with the astronaut program because he was so famous. You could make that argument, but actually he didn't give that many interviews in proportion to the sort of figure he was. He gave relatively few, and that's one of the things that people have pointed out. And why? But why would Aldrin resign? Why would Collins resign? Why didn't they become trainees for the next group of astronauts or something?
Right.
That would seem more logical, wouldn't it? But focusing on Collins, what he said at the press conference, which he'd shown the clip from, there's one thing we can highlight, and he said that in the press conference he distinctly says, because Armstrong is asked by Patrick Moore about seeing stars, in the solar corona, I think is what Patrick Moore's interested in. Could you see the corona around the sun? And Michael Collins says, I don't remember seeing any stars.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
You know, so he's in the command module, do not remember seeing any stars. Yet he writes in his book Carrying the Fire, on page 221 from 1974, this book, that he was on a Gemini 10 spacewalk. My God, the stars are everywhere, above me on all sides, even below me somewhat, down there next to that obscure horizon. The stars are bright and they are steady. Of course, I know that a star's twinkle is created by the atmosphere, and I have seen twinkleless stars before in a planetarium, but this is different. This is no simulation. This is the best view of the universe that a human ever had. So why...
That's Michael Collins.
That's Michael Collins speaking about his Gemini 10 trip, but according to the press conference with the Apollo mission, he says he didn't remember seeing any stars. Okay. I mean, this is one of the stories which does not add up.
Right. Now, another astronaut who is alleged to have walked on the moon is Dr. Edgar Mitchell. And you made some comments on a previous Richplanet show about Dr. Edgar Mitchell, which I think you received a few emails about.
Yeah, a couple of emails, that's right, when I said he was the sixth man never to walk on the moon. You know, and well, we made a little joke about that. And you know, that my reason for saying that comes from this data, this evidence.
Well, what we're referring to here is alleged free energy devices, in particular one called the N machine, which was developed by Bruce De Palma. Bruce De Palma ended up dead, and he was visited by Dr. Edgar Mitchell. In what year would that be, Andrew, roughly?
It would probably be in the 80s, I think, sometime in the 80s. I don't know the exact year, but probably mid-80s, early 80s, something like that.
Well, let's just watch this clip.
Basically, he was visited by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who heard about his N machine, came to see it working, and then Edgar Mitchell made De Palma a paltry offer to buy out the machine, and De Palma says, no, I'm not, I wouldn't sell up for that. And then Mitchell said to him, Edgar Mitchell, the same Apollo 14 guy, said to
the sixth man on the moon,
allegedly, to never walk on the moon.
Sorry?
Yeah, exactly, yes. The sixth man to not be on the moon, so he could be somewhere else at the same time.
So you don't think Mitchell walked on the moon?
No, he didn't. He didn't walk on the moon. That's a whole other story. But
right, okay.
Anyway, it depends how much of this you edit in or out.
Yeah.
But I'm just going into this.
So Mitchell, so it's a device using a similar principle to Trombley's, over unity, allegedly called an N machine.
The N machine.
Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who we know as the Apollo 11 astronaut, not Apollo 11, Apollo 14. Tries to buy his device.
Correct, or it makes him an offer. De Palma refuses, and then Edgar Mitchell says to De Palma, according to De Palma, if you're going to go around doing this sort of thing in California, you're going to get your head blown off, which of course De Palma said was a threat.
One of the pivotal people that I encountered early in my career was Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut.
Mitchell became extremely interested in De Palma's N machine. He made De Palma a paltry offer to buy out the invention, which De Palma naturally refused.
He said to me that if I ever tried anything on my own in California, I would get my head blown off.
And De Palma further, and this is another topic I wanted to comment on, says that, Mitchell then was at that time involved with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and that is still going, IONS, Institute of Noetic Sciences, and Mitchell talks about that, and there's various other people involved with that. I know that Uri Geller has been involved with
Mitchell's very much into healing using electromagnetic fields and telepathy or consciousness, this kind of thing. Psychic phenomena.
And that falls under the remit of this IONS research that he claims to be, kind of involved with helping to get credibility for. And De Palma says that that's basically a CIA front, that those sorts of organisations like IONS are a CIA front to keep an eye on what people are doing, who are coming up with these free energy devices, what sort of things they've developed, how they're planning to develop them. And that's what De Palma says in this clip. De Palma himself, he ended up dead in 1997.
So you think Dr. Edgar Mitchell is an operative then?
Of some kind.
Quite serious claims there about Dr. Edgar Mitchell, that he's not quite what he seems. Can you expand on that?
Well, I mean, one of the things which caught my attention was something which was on Richard Hoagland's site, the Enterprise mission, and that's a transcript of an interview that Mitchell did with Richard Hoagland, I think in 1996. It was actually, May the 15th, 1996. And Edgar Mitchell talked about people asking him what it felt like to walk on the moon. He said that people would ask him what he felt like to walk on the moon. And he said, I didn't think it was a germane question. And germane means relevant, so in other words, he didn't think, having a feeling of what it was like to walk on the moon, we didn't think it was relevant to talk about that. And then when he thought about that for a bit, he said, should I know what it felt like, should I know what I felt like on the moon? So I went to some good friends of mine, Dr. Jane Houston and her husband Bob Master, and said, help me find out what I felt like on the moon.
Right.
Why would you go to somebody to ask them to help you find out what you felt like when you walked on the moon? And I think he underwent hypnosis as part of this therapy, and then he said this was when his consciousness was, expanded, and this is what spurred him on to form this IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which
Bruce De Palma claimed was a CIA front.
Correct.
Now, do you want to talk about Bart Sabrell now?
Yeah, Bart Sabrell. I mean, he's done a couple of great movies for people looking at this area, and I think the evidence in them is pretty compelling, almost all of it. And he made a movie called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. It's about 1 hour 45 minutes, 55 minutes, that sort of time.
So he would approach some of the Apollo astronauts and he would challenge them.
Well, the first movie looked at some of the things we've looked at,
right.
And then he came across this footage where there's an apparent shot in the Apollo 11 capsule where they're in Earth orbit, and they're trying to make it look like they're a long way from the Earth, and they're showing the Earth at a distance, when in reality they're in low Earth orbit.
So this video is shot from inside the command module, and it's looking at the Earth.
Correct.
But the astronauts are claiming to be filming it from the window, but they're actually filming it from the back
of the
craft.
spacecraft. Yeah.
Some people have claimed that they had a
cutout. They had a cutout
to right, to obscure the craft and to perhaps make the Earth into a crescent shape.
That's right.
The whole thing trying to make the Earth look further away than it was.
Correct. That's the object of the exercise, and you could see this where they take away the cover and they switch the lights on the capsule, so that the blackness of space, is no longer simulated.
And so Bart Sabrell, when he gets an interview with Dr. Edgar Mitchell, he shows him
that particular clip.
He shows him this clip, and at one point you can see somebody's arm, which is showing that the camera was not at the window, but it was further back in the craft.
Correct,
so
correct.
I don't know whether they were trying to make it look like the Earth was further away than the Moon or not. But what's interesting to me is when Bart Sabrell starts discussing this with Dr. Edgar Mitchell, it's what happens after that.
This is, what is this? Oh, this is a shot from 130,000 miles out. I guess it's from approaching. It's from approaching the Moon, looking back at the Earth. Now, I've seen this on a couple of flights. Was this something that you got? Although this is from Apollo 11, did you shoot a shot of the Earth like this? So you had a TV camera in the spacecraft.
That's correct.
And this is, I guess, the Earth zoomed in at a distance.
Yep, seems to be.
They get shot a little bit halfway to the Moon. Now it's kind of, I guess the cloud cover looks.
That's what you're looking at.
Now what is that right there?
What is what?
There's like an arm. It looks like hair on an arm getting in front of the window.
Maybe somebody got their arm in front of.
Now I thought that was the arm of God moving across the Earth. I couldn't quite figure that out.
I suspect that was the edge of the window, more than likely, that they were shooting at.
What did the Earth look like from a great distance? There it is again, 130,000 miles out.
About like that.
So it's pretty small at the distance of the Moon?
Yes, but I think the better images are the Hasselblad images that have been taken on every flight and are the most published pictures in the history of the world.
What is that in the top left? If that's the Earth, is that like another spacecraft?
No. That, I have no idea what that is. It's some aberration on the film of some sort. Oh, those are shadows, I think. Or reflections, probably reflections that are just reflecting.
Run that back again, so we get another shot of it.
If you're going to press me on this, I'm not going to talk to you anymore, because I won't pursue this. All of this attempt to say the Apollo programs were fake is just sheer nonsense. And you can talk till hell freezes over, and you're wrong. Okay?
Well, would you affirm?
I won't continue on this line. Okay, turn off the camera. Your interview is done. I've given you all the time I'm going to give you.
Okie dokie. Good to meet you.
I don't say it's a pleasure.
Understand.
Please get your ass out of my house.
Okay.
And you came here under false pretenses, and I think you're an asshole.
Well,
and if you continue this, and if you press this, I will personally take you to court.
I hope that you do. I invite you to. I'm going to give you my card so you can arrange that. And I'm encouraging you to arrange.
You're frankly not worth it.
No, we have you on the record saying you'll take me to court. I hope you do. Because we have proof that would prove it in a court of law that Apollo 11 didn't go to the moon. And I think it's something that you should see it. I don't say that lightly, believe me. I don't say it lightly.
You have joking, sir. People can have fun. And maybe do that if they feel like they want to have a little fun on a trip to the moon. As an independent producer,
okay, we're heading out.
Doing that is against moral ethics.
Lying about going to the moon is a satanic lie of gigantic proportions.
I don't hit people, but you're going to be on the deck unless you get...
I'm heading out. I appreciate it.
And get the hell out of the black house. You ever get a gun and shoot them at them before they get out of the office?
We have a video camera running if you want to do it.
Right.
That would be great footage for us. See you later. In court, I hope.
Want to call the CIA? Have them whacked.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about Apollo astronauts. Okay, Andrew, so Dr. Edgar Mitchell's son clearly says in that clip, shall we phone the CIA and have them waxed? What does that mean?
You tell me. It's not an expression I'm familiar with. We can speculate what it means. It doesn't sound very complimentary. Does it mean, you know, we will have their memory erased? Does it mean we'll have them killed?
So it's a pretty safe bet then, based on that evidence and based on the Brewster Palmer evidence, that Dr. Edgar Mitchell is working for the CIA.
Or some version thereof, yes.
Right. As some kind of operative.
As I would say he is, yes.
Right. And you're convinced he didn't walk on the moon?
Correct.
Right.
I am, yes.
Right.
Okay. Other people may not be, but I am.
Right. We've got some clips here of Bart Sibrel approaching Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. And
you believe in UFOs? You believe we've been visited by? Well, why do you want to believe this?
I know for a fact. I've had this analyzed. And this is the window. And you're stated by an atomic clock at the Goldstone tracking station, which is on the tape.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy. Why don't you talk to the administrator at NASA? We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight.
I know for a fact.
You really like it?
You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief. Mr. Armstrong, Bart Sibrel, ABC Digital. Wanted to give you the opportunity to swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon. Will you put your left hand on the Bible and swear to God that you walked on the moon?
Gentlemen.
Mr. Sibrel.
Yes? If you really walked on the moon, why would you not do that? So why don't you just put into the record in the argument and put your hand on the Bible, swear to God you walked on the moon.
Mr. Sibrel, knowing you, that's probably a fake Bible.
Really? Well, no, it's a real Bible. You have the opportunity to have $5,000.
The meeting is not open.
Well, you have $5,000 cash. You can give it to charity if you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon.
Please
I have
give
the
it to
tape.
charity. That'd be fine.
Why don't you swear to... Why not? Why won't you do it? So why don't you put your hand on the Bible and swear to God that you walked on the moon?
Mr. Sibrel has made a fool of himself in front of the world. Mr. Sibrel, you do not deserve answers.
Neil Armstrong is visibly shaken by that. He does not want to swear on the Bible that he landed on the moon. What do you take from that, Andrew?
Well, I mean, again, you know, it's more speculative, but you looking at the body language and the reactions. Unfortunately, you know, there is a confrontational situation, particularly with Neil Armstrong, where Sabrell has burst into this business meeting that Armstrong's addressing. So it's not an ideal situation, you know, to get a kind of honest statement from. You know, so you can see that it's not a great situation now. The clip with Armstrong, Sabrell, you know, I've heard him interviewed, and he regrets having done that now.
Right.
He regrets that Aldrin punched him in the face and so on. It got to that. But I think at the time he was so annoyed. He was so, you know.
Well, he thought he'd been conned by...
Yeah, he felt so conned by these guys that he felt he had to go up and tell them, you know, he says, you said you walked on the moon, you didn't, you know, and Aldrin's accusing Sabrell of slimy journalism. Well, you know, Sabrell thinks, well, you're accusing me of slimy journalism. What about you being slimy all these days, saying you went to the moon, you didn't, you know? And so it's very uncomfortable to watch, and unfortunately that discomfort takes away a little bit from, you know, being able to sort of evaluate it dispassionately and look at what's actually been done and said and this sort of thing. So uncomfortable to watch, but I think nevertheless a good documentation of statements from the astronauts about what they claim to have done. Now,
I actually think they're covering up other things, not just that perhaps the rockets weren't capable of getting to and from the moon. Now, Buzz Aldrin has made quite a few statements in the media regarding a monolith on Phobos and the fact that he says that the Apollo mission was followed to the moon by a UFO.
Right.
So let's just take a look at that clip now.
There was something out there that was close enough to be observed, and what could it be?
Traveling alongside Apollo 11 was a mysterious object, like this one filmed on a later mission. If the object wasn't part of Apollo's rocket, it could be only one thing: a UFO.
Mike decided he thought he could see it in the telescope, and he was able to do that, and when it was in one position that had a series of ellipses. Now, obviously, the three of us were not going to blurt out, "Hey, Houston, we got something moving alongside of us, and we don't know what it is. You know, can you tell us what it is?" We weren't about to do that, because we know that those transmissions would be heard by all sorts of people, and who knows what somebody would have demanded that we turn back because of aliens or whatever the reason is. So we didn't do that, but we did decide we just cautiously ask Houston, how far away was the S4B?
Apollo 11, Houston, the S4B is about 6,000 nautical miles from you now, over.
And a few moments later, they came back and said something like it was 6,000 miles away because of the maneuver. So we really didn't think we were looking at something that far away. So we decided that after a while of watching it, it was time to go to sleep and not to talk about it anymore until we came back in debriefing.
Okay, so clear statements there from Buzz Aldrin that there was something else other than just the Apollo craft. Now, after that documentary was made, I believe he appears on a radio station and he seems to be backtracking on what he said. He's asked if this was the case, and he changes the subject essentially.
I have been always interested in extraterrestrial life, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I had heard that someone was saying that you had seen a UFO. NASA said don't say anything about it, and we might as well get it from the horse's mouth, Buzz. Did you see anything unusual up there?
Well, you know, a guy by the name of Charles Berlitz wrote something about the Roswell incident, and to establish his credibility, he had a little table in the front of his book which attempted to take advantage of alleged observations of people of unusual sightings. And he specifically referred to Anglia TV's reported this, that had been cited by somebody else, that Neil and I saw some green things, green creatures. Well, this kind of spoiled my credibility and a lot of other people. So I decided to take him to court and sue him because he was repeating phrases that were inaccurate and not done the right kind of, well, we won the suit. And I, hopefully it would cause a few people to be a little bit more careful in how they try and treat trusted servants of our government and of our people to tell the truth. I just feel that it's a little irresponsible of people to, especially after so many years, to bring up subjects that have been explained rather thoroughly, especially in our case in debriefings.
All right, so he's clearly avoiding talking about being followed by a UFO.
I say he flip-flops on the issue. On the one hand, he claims to have seen something that followed them, and then in the Coast to Coast clip, it's like he says, people have tried to misquote me about seeing, extraterrestrial things.
All right.
So it's like he's flip-flopping on the issue.
Right. Now there are a number of other people who allege to have seen things on the moon. One of them is Carl Wolf, who spoke at the Disclosure Project conference. We've shown this clip several times before on Richplanet because I find it a very compelling clip. This engineer, Carl Wolf, he's trying to repair a piece of photographic equipment, and he is shown images of things on the moon. So let's just take a look at it.
I was interested in how the whole process functioned, how the data got from the lunar orbiter to the laboratory. I asked the young man if he described the process to me. He did. About 30 minutes into the process, he said to me, in a very distressed way, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And then he proceeded to put photographs down in front of me, and clearly in these photographs were structures, mushroom-shaped buildings, and towers. And at that point I was very concerned because I knew we were working on compartmentalized security. He had breached security, and I was actually frightened at that moment, and I did not question him any further.
She was approached by someone who was in quarantine with the Apollo astronauts,
right.
Who'd said, and the astronauts had told this person who'd come to her that there was a base found on the moon.
Another incident, I knew someone in quarantine with the Apollo astronauts. He told me that the Apollo astronauts saw craft on the moon when we landed. And that is what he told me. And he also was afraid, he said that the astronauts are told to keep this quiet. They're not allowed to talk about it.
He was a psychiatrist,
right.
And he worked on the Apollo project.
Right.
And he was involved in the quarantining of the astronauts, and it wasn't nothing to do with quarantining from viruses or bacteria.
From information.
It was the information, and making sure that the astronauts were okay. And he said that the astronauts had told him that about the base on the moon.
And I will testify under oath before Congress that what I'm saying is the truth.
Okay, so claims of bases on the moon, claims of other craft on the moon. What do you make of that?
Well, again, Winter is just more of speculation, but with a bit of testimony. I also think that Carl Wolf is telling the truth about seeing this photograph of the base on the moon. And then, as we were discussing earlier, whether we'll get time to show this particular clip or not, I'm not sure. But the William Hamilton clip from 1998, where he was at a conference in MUFON, LA. And I've shown this clip many times in presentations I've done because I think it overlaps between the testimony about the secret space program and what's going on Mars. There seems to be some overlap with this thing that William Hamilton tells you, this account that he comes out with. So there are a number of areas. I mean, I have mixed feelings about the stories of stuff on the moon. I haven't seen a lot of good images. I think I've seen more interesting images coming from Mars about stuff on Mars than I have from the moon. John Lear is a big, has a sort of big statement about the bases being on the moon, and there have been mining operations, and he claims he's got pictures of them, and they're on his website. He even has a website called thelivingmoon.com, as you're probably aware. and I think there's some interesting stuff on there which, in all honesty, I haven't studied in great detail. But some of the stuff that I've seen, it's clearly not correct. There was an image I saw a few years ago which was claimed to be a moon base, and it's actually part of a Disney film, a segment of a Disney film. It's a still from that, and that circulated around as a moon base. So,
well, when I interviewed Timothy Good, he did claim that a German doctor had spoken to Neil Armstrong at a NASA conference and been overheard making similar statements. So let's just take a look at the clip of Tim Good.
Also, from a friend of mine, a former lady who worked in MI6, she met Neil Armstrong in Italy, and he confirmed to her, she'd overheard a conversation of him talking to a German doctor at a NASA conference, and then she confronted Armstrong with this information, and he admitted, yes, there were craft on the moon when they landed, and they were very frightened by it, and they felt threatened.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Andrew Johnson about the moon. Now, we've moved off the topic of did we land on the moon, because in my mind it's clear that something is being hidden, and some people think it's just that we didn't land. I personally think there's a lot more to it than that, and we listened to some statements before the break of people alleging that either craft or bases are on the moon, and that other people have alleged that there is a secret space fleet, not just spacecraft, space fleet, or fleets even, that are being flown from somewhere on the globe by some secret group. And I think that's likely when you look at the backward technology, the rocket technology that they're still putting on display for the public. I think we have propulsion systems that go way beyond that. And one person is, who's alluded to this is Gary McKinnon.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, at the end of the presentation I put together, I sort of move into this area of the secret space program. I don't talk so much about the moon bases and such, so I'm glad we've sort of had a chance to mention that. But Gary McKinnon talked about discovering this spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, with the title of non-terrestrial officers, as part of his hacking into the Pentagon and NASA systems.
There was an Excel spreadsheet, and the title was non-terrestrial officers, and it had names, ranks. Wasn't a long list, didn't even fill the whole screen, I think.
Well, could you just generally say how many? I mean, if you were to guess, are we talking 20, 50?
20. Maybe 30. And the other thing was a list of ship-to-ship and fleet-to-fleet transfers. Bear in mind, fleet-to-fleet, so multiple ships, of materials. And these ships weren't, US Navy ships. Again, I don't remember any of the names, but I remember at the time looking and trying to match up the names, and there wasn't anything that matched.
What did he discover? Some people have said that this was just from a computer game. What he'd seen was somebody's plan that they were playing on a computer game. One of these games like Homeworld or something.
Well, and it's interesting to note how Gary McKinnon was dealt with by the Americans, or what they threatened to do, to extradite him and put him in prison for 70 years. That's what they were threatening.
Going back to 9/11 for a moment, the alleged 20th hijacker, I think his name was Zachariah Moussaoui. I think it was, I may have got the pronunciation hopelessly wrong, but he was named as the 20th hijacker, and they wrote an indictment against him, a set of criminal charges, and they arrested him and had a hearing. It wasn't a trial; it was a hearing, and they dressed it up in the media as a trial, but it wasn't. It was a hearing, and his indictment was written by somebody called Paul McNulty. So Paul McNulty was a US government official who was responsible for writing the indictment for Zachariah Moussaoui, the 20th hijacker, and he also wrote Gary McKinnon's indictment when they levelled the charges against Gary. Right. So I thought that was an interesting sort of tidbit that I learned.
So in other words, it's two areas that they're covering things up on.
Seems
that
to
this
be.
person may be connected in some way.
Seems to be.
All right.
But again, you bring in the things like the photographs of Ed Grimsley with the night vision binoculars, where he seems to have picked up these sort of semi-cloaked ships that you can see with night vision goggles. Some of this evidence together, and the other one that's in my presentation is John Leonard Wolson, who seems to have disappeared off the scene. He said that he's developed this optical method linked to a 10-inch telescope where he can resolve certain things in orbit, which I don't know how far out they are. And if you watch a film called Interstellar, you'll see some of these objects that he's filmed, and they really do appear to be up there in the night sky. If you watch all of the film, I don't think that he's making this up. And so whatever he's filmed is very unusual.
Well, now, the other person that you mentioned was William Hamilton, who spoke at a MUFON conference. MUFON is the Mutual UFO Network, in the late 1990s. And he mentioned that he'd made contact with someone connected to this alleged secret space program who was telling them about the various space vehicles and space platforms that they have. Do you want to just touch on that, Andrew?
Yeah, well, we can show the clip, but the interesting thing that caught my attention, well, many interesting things about the clip, and I've shown it at a number of talks I've given over the years, very kindly sent to me by a friend who lives in San Francisco. A few years ago she sent me this on a DVD, and he talks about, William Hamilton talks about meeting this colonel in the Air Force, and he said that he'd been on this ship to Mars, a ship that could leave the atmosphere and travel at 8/10 the speed of light, 0.8 c, as we'd see it written down, and go to the planet Mars. And he said they landed at a base underground, and you can hear the rest in this clip. Is this story true? Well, we may never know, but again, it's stacking these things up into some kind of pattern, which is what you and I try and do.
Let's take a look at it.
This colonel is a real warrior type guy, and he had a degree in plasma physics. And he was also a consultant to NASA, and he was a consultant to people out at the Palos Verdes nuclear power generating station just 50 miles west of Phoenix. The other thing he said was there was a base on the moon. I find that quite astounding. I mean, I have heard astounding things, not only from this colonel, okay, but also probably the highest rank was a retired 3-star general, lieutenant general in the Air Force. And he knew another guy that I was in contact with, and this other guy claims that he worked 7 years on the U.S. anti-gravity program. And I have a fraction of what he told me, and I've got it tape recorded. It's true. Whoa. What a sham the space program is. Because there's another space program going on. A secret space program. And that's what I was attempting to find. In fact, you don't have to go too far to find that there is some secret space programs going on, because they had their own shuttles and their own astronaut crews right out here at Vandenberg Air Force Base, unbeknownst to everybody, and they scuttled a $5 billion facility that was housed there at one time. That was back in the 80s. But the kind of space program he was talking about is using a spacecraft that can leave the bounds of our atmosphere and travel to the planet Mars at 0.8 c, 8/10 the speed of light. And I said, how do you know that? I've been there, he said.
Interesting words there from William Hamilton. Now, there is something which has been covered up in physics which can lead you to how these propulsion systems are possibly working. And like I say, they were developing anti-gravity in the late 1950s, and then it went black, as they say. And all they put out is rocket-based technology. That's what makes me suspicious that there is something hidden. And why would they hide it? The answer that I would give is that if everyone had access to that sort of technology, you could create a vehicle which could get you into space quite easily and get you to the bottom of the ocean. and you could travel anywhere. They don't want to give people that freedom. Would you go along with that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the evidence and you tie together stories like William Hamilton's story, you look at the research of Nick Cook and what happened in the 50s with the anti-gravity research and so on, it really, that's where it all points to, and then there's these stories of the Nazis developing saucers at the end of the Second World War. How many of those are true, I'm not sure, but it tends to be pointing in the same direction, that there is this separate development which is almost completely hidden, and all we see of those developments are these silent craft that people report, very regularly. I mean, in Hamilton's clip, the guy said that he was in touch with somebody who worked for 7 years on the US anti-gravity program, which is completely undisclosed.
Now, Stan Deo is another person who was alleged to have been probably on the fringes of that program, but still involved in the late 1960s, and he has claimed that there is a base at the South Pole. That is his claim. And Deo, I find, an extremely convincing whistleblower. So if they are flying craft, that's my bet. That's where my money is, that there's a base at the South Pole. It may sound crazy, but why would someone as credible as Stan Deo make that claim?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not convinced about the base at the South Pole, other than the McMurdo Station, which Michael Palin went to in his documentary. That we know that that's there. But as to secret installations, I mean, it's a very inhospitable place, and with this sort of technology, you would be able to hide it elsewhere, which in places that were more hospitable. So I'm not sure about I haven't seen credible evidence of that.
Now, what about other theories about the moon, Andrew? Because I've heard it said that there was a probe, a NASA probe on the moon, a vibration probe, that some physicist analysed the signals from it and said, well, the moon's hollow because it's actually ringing when this probe is being struck.
I believe, there was a probe that I think it was maybe a seismometer that they had on the moon, and then a fairly sort of reasonable sized asteroid struck, or meteoroid or whatever, of a few tons in size or whatever, and it was enough to register on this seismometer, and they said it rang like a bell, and the implication being the moon was indeed hollow. And I read one of these books years ago, about the moon being a space station and not not a rock.
That it was towed into place. It's artificial. It's got engines inside it.
You apparently, they claim that if you look at the width of the craters, and consider how deep they should be based on the size of the impact, that many of these craters are way too shallow, for what the speed of the impact should be. Now, I don't know, and I haven't looked at those things myself, so my own personal jury is still out on what the moon actually is. All I will do is point out some unusual things about the moon. One is that it's we get the total solar eclipse, and from using the size of the moon. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it's 400 times nearer. The sun is 400 times further away, in other words. So we get this perfect eclipse effect, which is how come we get that? That's a weird coincidence. And of course, the motion of the moon seems to be tied in with a woman's menstrual cycle, which I don't think has ever been properly explained to my knowledge, if there is anything to do with that. So it's true that it does seem to have an effect on our lives, directly.
There's the fact that it spins at the same rate that it goes around the Earth, so it always presents one face to the Earth, like this. Now, if you read why that's happened,
so it's like a gravitational drag.
That it was spinning at some point, and one half of it is attracted to the Earth more because it's
got greater weight.
So eventually it starts to. So I would say, well, why hasn't that happened to the Earth going around the Sun? Why doesn't the Earth present one face to the Sun? Why does the Earth still spin and the other planets still spin? So why is the Moon locked into this? It's almost as if they've been designed to keep this one side hidden from the Earth, people on the Earth. But you can't say that.
You can't say anything about other than it's a coincidence.
Coincidence, right? Okay.
Yeah. So, and I mean, just to mention David Icke's book that people I'm sure may write to you about, the Moon Matrix and stuff, and he reckons that the Moon is some type of regulating or control mechanism for this holographic matrix that we've all, we all live in on the Earth. I mean, I haven't read his book, so I can't really comment. He could be right for all I know, But so there's a lot of theories and speculation about what the moon is and what it isn't. But personally, you know, I haven't looked into those things, so I don't think I can usefully comment other than that I know these ideas are out there. You know.
All right, Andrew. Well, thanks for today, and we are going to do another show where we're going to look at other bodies within the solar system, such as Mars and Phobos. But until then, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.